So let's get right to it. Have you ever wondered if you can actually sue your own state government? Sounds like a simple question, right? But the answer is tangled up in a 200-year-old power struggle at the very heart of the United States. Let's break it down.
I mean, think about it. Let's say a state agency damages your property. Or maybe you think a new state law is stomping all over your rights. Your first thought might be, I'm gonna sue. But can you? Well, it's not a simple yes or no. It's a legal labyrinth that goes all the way back to the founding of the country, and it all kicks off with one court decision that sent shockwaves through the brand new nation. Okay, so at the core of this whole thing is a really old legal idea called sovereign immunity. Basically, it's the concept that you can't sue the king, or, the government, unless they say it's okay. This was just the way things were, a concept the US got from English law. But then the new Constitution came along, and some of its wording seemed to challenge this old rule, creating a huge crisis right out of the gate.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing. The country's brand new, the states are drowning in debt from the Revolutionary War, and the Constitution drops this controversial little clause in Article 3. It basically says federal courts can hear cases between a state and citizens of another state. Well, creditors saw a golden opportunity, and in 1793, a Supreme Court case called Chisholm v. Georgia just blew the doors wide open. They ruled that yes, a citizen from South Carolina could absolutely sue the state of Georgia in federal court.
And the reaction across the country? It wasn't just surprise, it was absolute fury. The states felt like their very existence was under attack, and they were terrified of going bankrupt. The political backlash was immediate, it was powerful, and it was aimed squarely at the Supreme Court's decision.
So just how big was this backlash? It was so massive that in just 2 years, which, by the way, the Supreme Court itself later described as moving with vehement speed, the country managed to propose and ratify a whole new constitutional amendment just to overturn that one single court case.
And here it is, the result, the 11th Amendment. The text is short and it is laser-focused. It's a direct reversal of that Chisholm decision. It says federal judicial power does not cover lawsuits brought against a state by citizens of another state or by a foreign country.
So on the surface, this looks like a clean surgical fix, right? It slams the door shut that the Supreme Court had opened. That should have been the end of it. But, when it comes to constitutional law, it's almost never that simple.
Because if you read that text really, really carefully, you'll spot a huge hole. It stops citizens of another state from suing, but what about a state's own citizens? The amendment says nothing about them. So could a citizen of Louisiana sue Louisiana in a federal court?
For nearly a century, that question just kind of hung in the air. Then, in 1890, the Supreme Court gave its answer in a case called Hans v. Louisiana. And whoa, the court didn't just interpret the amendment, they expanded it dramatically. They ruled that this immunity also protected a state from lawsuits by its own citizens, creating a way bigger shield than the text ever suggested.
So how on earth did they justify this huge leap? Well, they came up with something we now call the immunity theory. The argument went something like this. The 11th Amendment didn't actually create a new rule. No, instead it was just one example, a little hint of a much broader unwritten rule of sovereign immunity that they said was baked into the Constitution from the very beginning. They claimed they weren't adding to the law, they were just restoring it.
So with this immunity theory in their pocket, this idea that the amendment was just a piece of a bigger puzzle, the Supreme Court started applying the principle all over the place. Over the next 100 years, this idea was used to shield states from all sorts of lawsuits, from foreign governments, in federal administrative hearings, even in most maritime law cases, all things the text of the 11th Amendment never even mentions.
Okay, so if shield of immunity seems almost unbreakable, which begs the question, if states are this protected, can they just violate federal law and get away with it? Is there any way to hold them accountable in courts? The answer, thankfully, is yes, but like everything else here, it's complicated.
Over time, the courts have basically carved out 3 major cracks in this armor. First, Congress can just cancel a state's immunity when it's passing laws to enforce the 14th Amendment's civil rights protections. Second, a state can just volunteer to give up its immunity. And third, there's this clever legal workaround called the ex parte Young doctrine, where you can sue a state official, not the state itself, to stop them from enforcing an unconstitutional law. So yeah, while the general rule is that you can't sue a state, these exceptions are absolutely critical. They provide these complicated but essential pathways to make sure states are held accountable to federal law.
It's this constant, delicate balancing act between state power and individual rights. Which brings us right back to the fundamental question that's still being argued today. Even after more than 200 years of legal fights, the true meaning of the 11th Amendment is one of the most fiercely debated topics in constitutional law. There's just no simple consensus. The debate really boils down to two competing views. On one side, you have the broad immunity theory. People who support this, like scholar Bradford R. Clark, argue the amendment was this powerful defense of a core principle, state sovereignty. But on the other side, you have the narrow repeal view. Scholars like Vicky C. Jackson argue, no, the amendment was just a small, technical fix to court procedure. It was never meant to let states get away with violating federal law.
And that's really the heart of it all. Is the 11th Amendment this powerful shield, a cornerstone of state power designed to protect their dignity and their finances? Or was it just a minor procedural tweak that the Supreme Court later blew up into a much, much bigger deal?
Ultimately, this centuries-old debate isn't just about lawsuits, it's about one of the most enduring tensions in the entire American system of government. The question of whether you can sue a state is really a question of where we draw the line between the power of the government and the rights of the individual. And in courtrooms all across the country, that line is still being drawn today.